Hi there and welcome to the Explaining History YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the end of the Middle Ages. I've been teaching this online with my Year 7 group, and if you're listening, guys, hi, nice to catch up with you. And for anybody else, welcome, and we're going to talk a little bit about this kind of quite strange concept, because the Middle Ages didn't just end overnight. And these sort of arbitrary delineations in time that historians create to say this happened, this ended at around this time period, and this, another thing began. Well, it's really just kind of the use of language more than anything else. Historians say these things in order to simplify the world, and as we know, the world is dizzyingly complicated and very difficult to simplify. So we shouldn't have it in our heads that the Middle Ages definitely ended in 1485 with the English Middle Ages, or definitely ended at a particular date. Moreover, what we should see is that the gradual change from what we would call the Middle Ages to the early modern period is a long process of change that happens almost kind of invisibly. It's not something that people can tangibly put their finger on, and it happens over time. And the way in which it's better to think about these things is to think about what kinds of things constituted the Middle Ages, what kinds of things there were in the Middle Ages, and how those things gradually become superseded by other things in the early modern period. Now, this is being terribly vague, so let's look at one particular example. Let's look at things like land ownership. Now, we know, don't we, that when the Normans invaded England in 1066, they instituted a particular kind of feudal land ownership, where the king was the sole landowner. William the Conqueror was the sole landowner, and underneath him, the barons were gifted parcels of land, large estates, and they divvied those up between their knights, who then rented that land to the peasants. And the peasants have certain feudal obligations to their lords, and vice versa. The lords had what was referred to as noblesse oblige, the obligations of the nobility to protect the peasants and to ensure that they receive justice. You know, that people can't pinch their land or, graze pigs upon common land, or forage, or take things from the peasants without something being done about it. And so this relationship, this quid pro quo, I do for you, you do for me, relationship lasts throughout the Middle Ages, and it lasts into the early modern period as well. But in the sort of 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, you get new kinds of land ownership emerging, new kinds of farming, particularly intensive pastoral farming. That meant that instead of the economy being weighted towards peasants and peasant land ownership, the economy was weighted towards larger landowners who would own and enclose gradually fields to keep sheep and cattle, which were worth more money. So one change we can see through from the Middle Ages to the early modern period is the development of commercial ideas, the understanding of how one makes money and how an economy works and how one can maximise profit. And these ideas really find their full development from about the 17th and 18th centuries onwards in this idea that we now refer to as capitalism. So perhaps the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period was a transition from feudal systems of economic management, from the feudal system to an early capitalist system. Another transition from this period is that the ideas about individuals change. So in the early modern period, when there's much more printing and writing and a far greater written culture and ideas circulating around and more people to read them, because there's gradually growing literacy, not really for the peasants but for the middling sort of people and the aristocracy from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards. The idea that an individual has a purpose in the world that is not necessarily always dictated by God or by the king becomes increasingly popular. The idea that individuals might have rights, that individuals have rights that are that don't necessarily come directly from the king, but that are inalienable to them because they were born with them. This also develops throughout the early modern period, after the end of the Middle Ages, probably in the 16th and 17th centuries, and finds its expression in the English Civil War, in the Glorious Revolution, and then later in the Americas in the American War of Independence. So these developments are long after we would consider the Middle Ages to have ended. So the way the economy works, the way individuals are, and also the relationship between individuals and the church. The Church of Rome, the Catholic Church, is an international, a transnational body throughout the Middle Ages. That meant that if you were in England, or if you were in Spain or Italy, you would worship the same church and you would worship the same Pope. And the Pope has almost, in some instances, a higher authority than the king. Kings in the Middle Ages had to go to the Pope and essentially get his blessing for what they wanted to do. So, waging wars, questions around succession, that kind of thing. The Pope needed to be consulted. As we see in the 16th century, there is a Reformation, and part of the Reformation is the transition from having a Church of Rome that is above nations, that is that crosses national boundaries, to the idea that the king is the sole source of authority in the realm, and not just the king, but the king and his parliament and his government. So in Reformation England, one of the key features of the transition from the Middle Ages to an early modern period is the decline in the power of the Church of Rome, of the Catholic Church, and the development of modern kinds of government. Not exactly how we'd recognise it now, but a little bit closer than a kind of a government that is solely centred around the king, that is backed by the Catholic Church, to a government that is run by ministers with what would be called a civil service or a bureaucracy, and that sent instructions across the kingdom to local branches of government to tell them what to do. So here are three distinctions between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The development of the economy towards things like land ownership and, let's not forget, trade. The transition of from individuals, the transition of peasants thinking themselves as merely servants of the king, subjects of the king, to early modern people believing that they had more say in who they are and what they did, and having more rights that are simply that they are born with, not necessarily things that just the king gives them. And also the decline in the power of the Church of Rome across Europe. Now that, of course, is in the countries that had the Reformation, in places like France and Spain and Italy. The power of Rome maintains itself. Anyway, I hope you found that useful, and I will catch you on the next Explaining History video. Thanks very much. Bye.